Welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for a conversation we've entitled Building the Front, Strengthening Our Movement. Special shout out to folks who are streaming in live from Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. My name is Hashim Benford. I am a strategist with Grassroots Power Project, and I'm joined by my comrade and fellow strategist at GPP, Priya Johnson. And together we're going to be co-moderating tonight's discussion. We want to give a special thanks to Convergence and Forge for co-sponsoring this live panel. Both Convergence and Forge work with organizers and activists on the front lines of today's most pressing struggles to produce articles, videos, and podcasts that sharpen our collective practice, lift up stories from the grassroots, and promote debate. And so the goal of all of this is to help us sharpen our strategy and build the power we need to change society and the world. Tonight's event in particular serves as an accompaniment to a series of articles that were co-produced by the Forge and Convergence to analyze current political conditions coming out of the 2022 midterms. So if you haven't already, we strongly encourage you to check out the Convergence of the Forge website and check out that election coverage, the 2022 election coverage. So Priya and I are very excited to be asked to co-host this really critical conversation. As I'm sure everyone who's watching this knows, we are living through a political period that is really ripe with opportunity and very exciting for our movements. Over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen record-breaking numbers of people taking collective action in response to police violence, draconian immigration policies, and attacks on reproductive freedom. We've seen ever-growing numbers of people expressing support for socialism after more than a generation of us being told that there is no alternative to capitalism. And in cities and states across the country, left and progressive forces have built infrastructure to strategically engage in elections and build more durable power. At the same time of this excitement and these exciting trends, we face a very real and dangerous threat from an ascending right-wing has cohered as the MAGA movement. The agenda of this movement is one of unchecked corporate power and profiteering, and as well as hyper-patriarchal white nationalism. And while Donald Trump is their leader, we know that MAGA is much bigger than Trump. They include highly armed militias, leaders from major sectors of capital like the fossil fuels and defense industries, mass organizations like the NRA and mega churches, and they've even captured control of the Republican Party itself. Participating in today's dialogue is working from the perspective that the MAGA movement represents the main enemy of left and progressive forces today. We understand that defeating MAGA is of paramount importance for those of us who aspire to build a society that is based on universal inclusion, radical democracy, and an economy that cares for all people and the planet. Fortunately, left and progressive forces are not alone in our struggle against the right. We're part of a broad front that also includes liberal policy and advocacy, corporate-aligned elements of the Democratic Party, and even groups representing never-Trump Republicans. So when we talk about a broad front, what we mean by that is the widest array of groups and individuals that can be united around the need to push back against the vision, politics, and power of the MAGA movement. Because we care about transforming society and not just defending the status quo, we are faced with a generational task that actually has a dual nature. So on the one hand, we have to help build this front to defeat the immediate enemy of the right, while also growing the strength and leadership of our social movements so that we can build the power we need to actually restructure the economy and systems of governance. So we want to be able to move beyond this immediate threat and actually transform society, not just go back to the way things were. And this strategic orientation is about the long term. Our task, one that will be accomplished within the next few years, the next few election cycles, or the next few policy victories. We must remember the guidance of our comrade, Linda Burnham, who reminds us that we always bring our revolutionary imaginations to bear, but we must also come with our most practical and clear-eyed strategic thinking so that we can effectively advance politics in the world as it actually exists. This means, among other things, accepting the fact that within this broad front, we are allied with forces who will routinely underestimate us, treat us unfairly, and likely betray us at some point or another. And we know that this sucks. And so we just have to accept that that's part of the deal. We can't afford to walk away from these contradictions. Rather, we must learn to skillfully navigate them for the sake of our people. And most importantly, we have to build another so that we can leverage, so that we have the leverage to dictate the terms of how these contradictions will get negotiated. So how do we do this? How do we effectively build our own power and principally engage with centrist allies without compromising what we're ultimately fighting for? Well, that's what we've assembled this brilliant panel of speakers to discuss tonight. And to say a little bit more about who we pulled together, I'm going to pass it over to my friend Priya.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hashim. Again, I'm Priya from Grassroots Power Project, joining y'all from a very rainy Atlanta. I'm super excited and honored to introduce this fabulous panel. Each of them is holding down really important, critical work, and we so appreciate them making the time to be here. I'm going to share just a tiny bit about each of them. We've condensed their very impressive bios, but you can read more about each of them on Converge's Instagram. So first, we have Sendolo Diaminah, who is the co-director of the Carolina Federation, where he works to build governing power for working people and communities of color in the great state of North Carolina. He's a strategist with over 15 years of experience in community and electoral organizing, as well as experience winning and holding elected office. Alexa Horwart is the lead organizer for Faith in Minnesota. Faith in Minnesota is a multi-faith, multiracial, statewide people's organization working to advance racial and economic justice in Minnesota. Alexa has been leading statewide community organizing efforts for a decade, focused on small towns and rural communities. Next, we have Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party. In 2018, Maurice took the helm of the Working Families Party as National Director, where he is working hard to build a political home for a multiracial working class movement. And last but not least, we have Brendan Walsh, who's the Executive Director of Worker Power Arizona, where he has directed political and community programs for Unite Here Local 11 for the last 17 years and served as the ED of Worker Power since 2009. Welcome again, and thank you to all of you. So just a quick note before we start on format. Panelists, we have a few questions prepared for each of you, but we really want this to be more of a conversation. So just a reminder to feel free to chime in, respond directly to, or build off of each other. A big shout out to the audience watching across all the platforms, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter. Please do introduce yourself, drop your comments, questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to kind of engage them as we go along. And we'll also hopefully have some time for Q&A at the end. And if you haven't already, please give a like and subscribe to this channel. All right, so without further ado, let us get into the conversation. I'm going to kick it to you, Maurice, first. As someone who's just constantly trying to analyze and approach the challenge that Hashim named at the top for us from a national perspective, so both within federal politics, but also within different states and localities around the country. Can you just talk a little bit about the need to approach this tension in a generative way rather than an antagonistic one? So in other words, how can strengthening our partnerships with centrist allies actually help us build the power of left and progressive forces? What can we learn, for example, from the experience of working with Democrats to flip the legislature in Pennsylvania while still fighting to defend Krasner, the progressive DA in Philly?
Well, okay, great. Well, it's really good to be here, and I can't think of a better question to wrestle with. And I don't think we're going to figure it out in this hour. I think it's a question that needs to be on top of our minds day in and day out, and different strategies are going to work. From our vantage point at the Working Families Party, some examples. So on the national level, we played a role in helping to cohere the legislative coalition for the president's agenda, the Build Back Better agenda. Much of the flanks of the Build Back Better agenda we agreed with, and we agreed with those flanks because they originated as progressive ideas that came from outside of the Biden team, but eventually were so mainstreamed by the organizing that came out of years and years of work on the ground, right? Like concepts like the care economy and, concepts like framework like the Green New Deal, which even though they don't legislate it as the Green New Deal, those concepts, those ideas are around transitioning our economy to be a regenerative economy in a way that directly deals with the material conditions of people who have been hit the hardest by the fossil fuel industry and by climate change. That's embedded in a lot of Biden's agenda. And that in itself is a victory. That in itself demonstrates that our organizing is working. So we worked in coalition with people on all sides of the Democratic Party coalition in order to pass that agenda. And we saw how pieces of it got watered down or elements of it got outright sort of destroyed. We saw how people on the corporate end of the Democratic Party actually were the people who were the least principled, who often were the least disciplined and eventually turned on Biden when it mattered most. But it was progressives. And I think the story that often doesn't get told is how progressives really were the inside outside glue that kept the legislative possibilities going. And it was an interesting sort of relationship with the leadership of Congress, the Progressive Caucus, the White House, folks in the Senate, including the leadership of the Senate, grassroots organizations, that led to imperfect victories, but significant historical victories. And when you take a step back and you look at the last Congress and you consider that trillions of dollars were transferred from the federal government to state and local governments and then directly to people, this is one of the most significant transfers of resources down to the ground. And that wouldn't have happened in the same way if we weren't in coalition. Given, there's a lot of things that are left on the agenda. There's a lot of ways that the legislation is insufficient or actually problematic. But if you look at it a different way, if we hadn't been involved electorally and legislatively, and if progressives didn't play this principled role of staying at the table, being fair negotiating partners, then there's no way that we would have seen the scale, the scope, and the sophistication of that legislation. And then, going back on the ground, both in New York and in Pennsylvania, we elected Kendra Brooks as a standalone WFP municipal candidate, and so she's a city councilor. She's the only WFP city councilor at large in Philly, but she plays a critical role in governing, right? And because she ran with a citywide coalition, she built a broad citywide coalition. When she's sitting there, she's not this gadfly WFP candidate. She's sitting there representing a number of labor unions, grassroots organizations, communities that built this pretty broad, sort of very, very impressive coalition in order to get her elected. And so she's governing from a position of strength. And then as a result, she's able to build a coalition with her colleagues, her Democratic colleagues at the city council to pass groundbreaking renters access reforms for rental applications, housing protections like during COVID, and a number of other legislation that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for that one city council person. So it's a demonstration of how the left, even if there's just one left city council person, could take governing seriously and build coalitions broader than just the left. And with Kendra, with Brandon Johnson right now, with Helen Gim, who we endorsed in Philadelphia, none of these candidates can win if they're only talking to, communicating with, and trying to turn out leftists or people on the left or people who self-identify as progressives. It's their ability to build a bigger we, and to build that bigger we by articulating a irresistible platform and a agenda that meets people's material needs, but also is visionary enough to get people excited about being part of that project.
I want to see if any of the other panelists want to build off of anything Maurice said or ask any follow-up questions directly.
Maurice, I'm sure we're going to get into this more and more, but I'm like, what were some of those moments like when y'all either were like, we have someone in governance navigating those dynamics and we won something, right? Like, what's that like? And then what was it like for y'all when you were in that partnership and people turned on you, right? Like, what did y'all do in those moments?
Sure. I mean, I think different moments require different reactions. So like emotionally, whenever you feel like people are turning on you or people are disappointing you or people aren't aren't showing up principally, just personally as a human being, emotionally, that feels pretty demoralizing, right? And I think as political leadership, like, I think some of the emotional work is like allowing yourself to feel that emotionally, but then not make political judgments based on your emotional triggers, right? And so trying to figure out how to respond, what carrots and what sticks would be the most effective in order to help model what the type of relationship and behaviors we actually want. And we have a number of carrots and sticks, right? For us, one of our biggest sticks is the primary. And so, we use that. We actually use that tool where we demonstrate our ability and willingness to primary sitting Democratic elected officials, or in the case of Philadelphia, rescind endorsements, which we've done, right? So I think a part of it is demonstrating that we have a willingness to use all the tools, but also that we won't use the most maximal tool every time we're disappointed, and that we could escalate. And then also that we're willing to publicly go on the record as supporting them when they do the things that we want to do. So also showing that we're willing to demonstrate through positive reinforcement that we can be in coalition with them when they actually show up the way that we want to, and that we could kind of do both in order to stay in relationship and demonstrate that we are principled and measured and calculated in our ability to like wield those tools in order to keep our eyes on like the one sort of face of the struggle, which is like fighting authoritarianism, while being clear that like as much as we're concerned with fighting authoritarianism, it doesn't mean that we won't be in principal disagreement when we notice there's something that is like a neoliberal error that has to be corrected in the moment. For example, just like, this is a live example. The president, the majority leader, a bunch of Democrats are basically voting against DC home rule and voting with the right wing of the Republican Party. And we've gone on the record very publicly against them. Even as a few months ago, we were working with them very closely on passage of the complicated but historical Inflation Reduction Act, right? And then the last example I'll use is Kathy Hochul. So with Kathy Hochul, she's no progressive, but we endorsed her after we ran against her. We endorsed her in New York, and we proudly endorsed her and organized people to vote for her on the Working Families Party line in New York, her and Antonio Delgado. And our organizing was a significant component of her victory. And then only weeks after, well, a few months after, she put out a right-wing pick for the Supreme Court in New York, and we publicly organized against her and prevented that from happening. So we could do both, and it was the momentum and organizing that we built and the coalition that we built, ironically, to help her get elected, that gave us the organizing position in order to defeat her legislatively just months afterwards.
If I could jump in, Hashim, as well. Maurice, what you were just saying, so we worked very, very hard to elect Kyrsten Sinema in 2018, knowing exactly who she was. And we also, like you, encouraged everybody we could to get in behind that fight too. But the issue there was that we needed to prove that Arizona was a battleground state where you could invest in and win statewide races. So our big play was being able to get the investment of resources in Arizona to win the presidential election in 2020, which we were able to do, even though we had to kind of hold our nose to a certain extent with regard to Sinema. And then similarly to you, when she refused to move the filibuster, particularly with a carve out for voting rights, we did everything we could to move her from the inside. Like, we met with her staff many times. We met with colleagues. We did high road pushes, but then we actually did everything we could to hammer her publicly as well. TV ads, billboards, like whatever we could. Ultimately, they're unsuccessful, but I think, we've been interested, and we've been sort of playing the same inside-outside game that you describe as well. I am interested to know from you and others, though, like, I feel like the discussion, there's a certain extent to which we talk about we as and they, progressives and less progressives. But for me, it seems like in 30 years of doing this and trying to build multiracial, and in some respects with a economic diversity on the left, coalitions that it's much more of a spectrum than a we and they. And there's much more of a difference. Like I find myself as someone from labor, as a middle-aged white guy at a certain point, I'm often in the middle of that spectrum, as opposed to, like, I think of myself as way left, but there's a lot of people around here in Arizona who probably wouldn't categorize me as left as I think I am, right? And so there's an extraordinary amount of tension every day in trying to put these things together. And from the nonprofit perspective, I'm not sure working family parties or any organizations deal with this, but when you're competing for funding and you're competing for centrality in the narrative of how things change, and you're competing for political influence, I just feel like there's a lot of challenging, jealousies that can develop with the best of friends, right? And so for me, the kind of cuts that you're talking about in the swallowing your distaste or ego and not getting angry, trying to act principally, I think, as you said, with your principles and in coalition, it's super hard because it seems like there's some kind of slight you either received or accidentally made or purposely made and then regretted afterwards that you're having to deal with. So it's like, for me, that I hate when we assume that there's a category of progressive when there is a spectrum in which that we're at every single space and people can move up on those, up or down on that spectrum situationally.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Brendan. And I think it also brings to mind that when we talk about the we, and Maurice, you talked about building the we, like that isn't a self-evident thing. It's a thing that has to be constructed, and it's defined on our articulation of the vision, our strategic approach, our sense of what we're doing. And I think this is actually a good segue to pass it over to you, Sendolo. From our conversation and preparation for this, when we talked about the prospect of alignment, and what that can make possible. And just, to Brendan's point, just getting folks on the same page of like, who is the we that we're talking about and in reference to what other contradictory forces. We know that a lot of people struggle with building that kind of alignment for many of the reasons Brendan just named: disagreements over vision, fights over funding, all of that kind of stuff, the need to kind of make one's organization stand out within the philanthropic landscape, all of that stuff, which, brings to point a real tension, or what is often, I think, held as a tension that many organizational leaders feel to prioritize building their organization and to demonstrate the strength of their organization. And that can sometimes feel like that's in a contradiction with building alignment. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to invite you in to say a little bit more about kind of your thinking of how the process of alignment building can actually strengthen our organizations and clarify the work of each organization as part of a bigger political project. And kind of your, when you have wonderful dreams at night and you think about winning in North Carolina, like what does that kind of alignment look like? And what are the types of things you think we need to do to make that possible? And what would progress in a state like North Carolina look like over the course of the next 5 to 10 years?
I see you sneaking in multiple questions in there, Hashim.
You know how we do.
So, thanks for giving me that wide palette to work with. I think, so the organization I work with, the Carolina Federation, we're very, very new. We started building our chapters in 2019. So a lot of our attention has been on how do we build ourselves from a place of strength. And that came out of lessons of years before of trying to enter into alignment and coalition without entering in from a place of strength and without entering in from a place of confidence. And just to say, I think a lot of the dynamics that can happen and the difficulty in navigating them, if we're not solid and clear about what power and competence we're bringing to the table, then there's a lot more frustration, anxiety, doubt, that then it's like, we don't want people to see that. So then you got a posture and it gets real weird, right? So I think a lot of our attention in trying to build internally has been this, like, how do we get really strong at being like, we know we can deliver. The comrades earlier were talking about getting people into office, being able to mobilize to pressure for issues. And we wanted to get to a place of being confident that when we're like, all right, we're going to move, we know our people can move in the numbers with the depth, with the strength that is needed to win elections or to win on issues. And as we've been building that, part of what has happened, to tell the truth about ourselves, right, is it can lead to a moment where we're like, okay, we see something missing in the ecosystem, and we feel like, well, we know we can count on ourselves for this, so we're just going to grow to fill it. And so it could start leading to this drift and this kind of like expansion into lots of places. So coming from a place of strength, I think, is important. But then at a certain point, you can't grow strength in every area. And I think that is a lesson both for organizations and for individual leaders, that like being on a team means you are not the best at all the things. And that's not a bad thing. That is actually a wonderful thing. It allows us to specialize. It allows us to get deeper. And I think part of the discernment that our organization is in is, great, what are the things that we can really focus on? And then what are the things we can really count on others for? Now, that brings up all kinds of trust issues and real honest conversations about, we said we were going to hold the flank over here. You said you were going to hold the flank over there. What actually happened? Can we actually have those conversations? Can we be honest about that? And I just think that's part of the work of building that we, and the strategy part that can help define the layers of the we, like Brendan was talking about, right? Like we might have a core of people who long term are like, we want to see, for the Carolina Federation, we talk about democratic ownership of our governing structures and of our economy. That's not everybody who's fighting the right. Not everybody thinks that the economy should be democratized. We can work with those people, but they're not the core aligned around that vision. Then there's people who are like deeply opposed to all forms of white supremacy, deeply opposed to all forms of gender oppression. They're not with us on the piece about capitalism, but they're with us on those. Great, right? So there's all of these different layers for strategy. And I think that there's an ethical foundation and there's a value foundation that I won't say transcends, but permeates all of those. And the simple version is, if we're not able to be vulnerable and honest about what's actually going on, that is a stronger determinant to me about what kind of partnership we can be in than just ideology and strategy by itself. There are a lot of people who will profess positions, but when it starts talking about like, all right, we were trying to move towards that position and something broke down, what happened? If we're not able to be honest about that, I don't think we can grow real alignment. And I've seen people come in with divergence around strategy, but honesty about practice, that over time, the struggle is able to educate all of us and we're able to grow together. So to me, the long-term play is integrity and endurance. Can we stay in that with the widest range of people over time, with an openness to what might emerge in terms of who comes together? My hope is that in the state of North Carolina, we'll be able to grow to a place where, like Maurice was talking about, and really Brandon too, because we're trying to prove that North Carolina is the place to invest for the long term. And I think we can't do that with just the Carolina Federation. That takes multiple organizations like our comrades at Siembra NC, like our comrades at Down Home North Carolina, et cetera. So we have to build a bigger ecosystem for that. And I think the foundation of that is each of our organizations being very clear that being able to deliver large numbers of people and being able to raise our own resources. I'll talk more about that later.
I'd love to follow up on something there, if that's
Go for it. Was just going to call you in, Alexa. Go ahead.
Oh, sure. I'm just really struck, Sendolo, on the idea of public trust and integrity, and that is built with honest conversations, but it's also built by a regular demonstration of you do what you say you're going to do, and you can deliver what you say you're going to deliver. And I think also inherent in that, or required for that, is a shared power analysis and clarity about the interests of the various partners. Like that's not something that is behind the scenes held, but that's something out in front held. Who's delivering what? And what does it add up to? And what does everybody want out of that? And so I'm just really struck by the process of building public trust. I don't know if you want to say more about how you've done that, or anyone wants to build on.
Well, I was talking a whole bunch. I want to hear, how do y'all do it?
Yeah, or what are the things that make it hard to do that across? I mean, we've talked about the posturing, et cetera. Are there other dynamics that make that kind of trust hard?
I mean, I'll say one. I think a huge one is not a clear line of accountability. So if there are people at the table with you trying to negotiate, but they're not accountable clearly to a constituency, to a base, to a group of people that grounds their actions, then that you can't build public trust. And so you also come to the table with your people, and that has to be a clear line.
Maurice, I think you were trying to get in, but you were on mute.
I mean, there's so many, I think, dimensions of this, because and one dimension on its own is insufficient. So Sendolo, you brought up something that's really critical, right? And I think gets lost on a lot of us that want to be in coalition, right? We have to ensure that we are secure enough to be in coalition. And that requires the discipline to say no to coalition so that you could build a secure base, so that you can say yes to coalition and then bring something meaningful to coalition. And then you won't have to engage in the posturing or the theater or the performance, because you're grounded in who you are, what power you bring, the extents of your power, what you don't do. And you could say that with your chest and you don't feel any type of way about it. Then that gives you the requisite sort of capacities to be a principled coalition partner. But when you don't do that work, it's harder to be a principled coalition partner. So there's like there is a power component of this. Like, you have to come with your own power. And then that power needs to be self-evident or evident in your coalition, so that others need to be aware of your power as well, right? There's another aspect of this that is relational, but that is insufficient. But, you know, like when you struggle with people, we are humans, right? And when you struggle with people over time, then you're able to like wrestle with folks and extend trust and extend grace with individuals. Because on a certain level, there is a level where these are individuals wrestling around ideas and wrestling around sort of negotiations, and that's an aspect of it. And then there is like I really appreciate the power analysis stuff, because if there's a shared sort of assessment of the landscape and the power that we have as a coalition versus the power that we don't have, then the whole purpose of coming together makes sense. But if that's unclear, then it's hard to actually understand why you're there. And sometimes when you don't know why you're there, you actually don't know why you're there. And sometimes people are in coalitions for FOMO. It's like, I'm just there because everybody else is there, right? And so there's like a number of dimensions to this, and each one of them on their own is insufficient, but collectively, that's how you build a strong coalition and how you build like a bigger we that's functional and stronger.
Can I throw out another question just on this thread and call you back in, Alexa? I think, in our earlier conversation in advance of this panel, one of the things that you were very clear about was just the need for rigorous assessment of power and self-interest, which you were just starting to name. And I think we know that maybe the biggest incentive for centrist forces to relate to us is our ability to organize and mobilize our base, which is obviously a critical constituency in the voting coalition. So just wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about how your organization's proficiency at organizing, and particularly the play that you made during the Democratic primary for governor, has strengthened your negotiating position within that broader front.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I think you have to start first and foremost with a rigorous power analysis of your own power and look at that and really think about what is it going to take to get to the next level. So my organization really needed a breakthrough in the level of power we had. We could win issue campaigns. We could get our toe at the table, but we weren't a part of the big conversations in our state around budget setting and who's in the room when final negotiations happen. And we weren't at the governing table. So Minnesota is a caucus state, which means that our party endorsements happen with a small-ish group of folks who are elected to the state convention. And they're elected by going through a path of local organizing unit meetings. And they have to be elected by their peers at their precinct, at their Senate level, at their congressional level. And then they get to be a voter to decide the party endorsement and all the resources that come with the party endorsement. So we decided that we were going to decide the Democratic Party endorsement for governor, and that we were going to be a 10% block of voters at the state convention. And we launched an 18-month organizing process to get our people in formation for the kind of rigor and power that we would need. And thousands of people built squads and ran for small elections at each of these levels. And we ended up doing what we said we were going to do, which was we had 10%. There were 4 candidates in the field, and none of them could get the endorsement without us. And the big question was, can we hold our block together? Can our 10% stick together, or are they going to come apart and vote for different candidates? And I will say, like most of Minnesota politics, didn't believe we could. And we did. We stayed together. Our leaders, after 18 months, were pretty clear that faith in Minnesota was their political home, that they were more accountable to their political home, their organization that they would have power in, than they were to a particular candidate. And we decided that endorsement. Now, we then lost the primary. So in Minnesota, it's caucus and primary. We lost the primary, but it didn't matter for our power. We were on the chessboard in a way that was legible, like we had never been before. So an organization that can put thousands of people in a room and win issue campaigns becomes an organization that can decide an endorsement is a pretty significant shift in legibility of our power. And the person who did win the primary then became governor. And we have a fundamentally different relationship with that governor. We have a fundamentally different relationship with the chair of the Democratic Party, who approached our organizing process not antagonistically, but as an opportunity, right? And it allowed us to actually be in what we're in now, which is budget negotiations, and at the table, deciding where money goes as a state and really governing. So I think this idea of, as organizations, being really curious about the questions of what do we want next and what is going to take more power than we have now? How do we build that power? And then how do we leverage it in a set of relationships is really, really critical. So I'll let folks dive in on that.
Thanks so much, Alexa. I know folks are wanting to respond, but just really quickly, if you're just joining us, welcome. We're in conversation with some badass organizing leaders about the dual task of building the broad front and strengthening our movement, sponsored by Convergence and Forge. Brendan, I think you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's interesting because our organization has really done massive amounts of political work at the city level in Phoenix, Arizona first, but then at the state level. You know, the last 2 years, we knocked on 2 million doors in Arizona, far more than any other organization. Yet we don't have the political power that we'd like to. In fact, I think a large part of that is because we spend much more time on program than we do cultivating the political relationships. Like if at a certain point, we're in such dire, desperate straits to not elect Republicans or to fight against the MAGA Republicans, that, you know, once we put every bit of energy we have into the election, and then after the election we collapse and we just like kind of lick our wounds for a while. And then, you know, all of our expertise, we don't have lobbying expertise. We don't have massive and exciting communications programs and branding. You know, we have basically field people, right? So we're trying to change that, but there is one area where we have changed that. Phoenix, Arizona it's the 5th largest city in the United States, but it has only 9 city council people, including the mayor, who's 1 vote. And we did elect a former housekeeper, Unite Here organizer, my closest colleague, to city council. And we then elected another immigrant rights activist, Carlos Garcia, was, you know, very famous or very well-known immigrants rights activist here, was elected. And they together started organizing the rest of the city council because they were super, super progressive, fearless. And it turns out moved a bunch of policy for us that has been very successful in as much as they can in a state where there's a bunch of preemption. But in response, the centrist mayor has gone on a massive attack to attack our now way left voting bloc in city council. So we are in a death match right now in the city council race. The election's on Tuesday. We got 50 people in the field right this second. You know, it's a really hairy situation where, you know, we flexed and flexed and flexed. And at a certain point, it is really hard to build the political power. And then when you build it, you know, this is an instance where I think we've talked about before, the center forces are actually not helping at all. And they're in fact coming out, and they'd rather have, you know, business win than have our immigrant rights activists. It's just disgusting the way they are attacking him and trying to put in another centrist, and like using racial fault lines and all these kinds of things in the most cynical way. So I'd like to say, you know, that we are better able to use our ability to mobilize people to build political power. But I guess ours is a story and how we are able to do it, but it's a constant struggle and always more difficult than I had hoped it would be.
Yeah, you know, the example in Minnesota reminds me of, you know, the lesson that I think we're still learning out of Buffalo when we took on a 16-year incumbent and we ran India Walton. And most observers didn't think that the coalition that WFP had built around India Walton and the race that she was running had a chance at defeating a 16-year incumbent. They were wrong. We did. We won the primary. And we won it decidedly, right? It wasn't close. What I don't think we fully anticipated was how that victory would unite such a broad coalition from the very, very, very far right all the way to the center, right? And so I don't think we fully appreciated how that coalition would come together against India in the general election, right? And so, and then despite that, and I mean, and they spent a significant amount of money from very, very far right, like Trumpist, like white supremacist money, all the way to like, you know, traditional sort of like corporate, like real estate money against India. And you know, instead of doing what's traditionally done, which is like, you know, the person who loses the primary concedes and, you know, is gracious, he ran this right-wing attack in the general election and was able to prevail. India broke 40%, but nevertheless, that coalition prevailed. Now, I think there's lessons to be learned about that, about like once you win, how to be prepared for how your win might consolidate a new coalition in order to defeat you, right? And then had India won the general election, that coalition would have been consolidated during governance around ensuring that India failed and the whole project of her campaign failed, right? So it's like preparing for the victory and for the backlash, right? And but the other lesson I think is, even though we didn't win in the general, that organizing surfaced so many new leaders. That surfaced a desire in Western New York, not even just Buffalo, in all of Western New York, for other similarly situated activists and organizers to run similar campaigns. And then like there is like all of this electoral energy that did not exist before India's campaign that now we're beginning to organize in Western New York like never before. So in a win scenario or in a lose scenario, in a loss scenario, there's reasons to do to run the race. But even in a win scenario, you have to prepare for what comes after.
I want to jump in. Brendan's piece was encouraging me as another state that's dealing with MAGA being in control at the state level of things, and I just really resonated with this piece of us putting so much time and energy in fighting the right, and then having limited context in which progressive and left forces are the dominant group in shaping what's going on, in particular with governance. We also, with our affiliate Durham for All, we're able to get control inside of Durham City Council, Durham County Commission, our district attorney, as well as our school board. We were able to flip all of those elections with a number of, like a wide coalition in Durham that includes the People's Alliance and the Durham Association of Educators. A number of groups fought for those victories over a period of years. And we kind of came out of nowhere. They didn't really know what had hit them. They hadn't been used to people being serious about building electoral muscle, really being able to deliver people. And so for a number of years, we were able to move a lot of stuff. We were able to move police out of the police, our positions out of the police department into a first responder that's actually based on care with groups like Durham Beyond Policing. So things like that were possible. We got rid of the county manager who was opposing and blocking raises for our school staff, which was overwhelmingly Black working class women. And in all those fights, we were consolidating our opposition, right? Like our opposition got more and more. They kept coming after us and not winning those elections. And then eventually some conditions came together that they were able to break through. We're able to break our city council majority. And the pressure on our people, just to be very, very real, training our people to be able to withstand the contradictions of that kind of context, I think is its own topic that needs time, care, and attention. But I feel like this piece of what do we do, how do we navigate these things, isn't just how do we deal with this until we're strong enough to win the whole big thing. I'm like, this is governing. This is navigating power. And there's always going to be a range of people moving in and out of different kinds of alignment. And figuring out how we navigate that, I just think is critical for taking on this role, and that there's a shift from being just on the outside, from being just in opposition, to having the audacity to say, actually, if we think we can lead and govern the entire state, city, country, it means that we're saying we're taking on these contradictions. And I think it then raises questions for like, what does that then mean for our organizations? Like what needs to get built up? Like, I forgot who was saying it earlier, but like when we want to get to that next level of power, Alexa, yeah, you were saying that. What will it actually take? What will it actually take in terms of our leadership development? What will it actually take in terms of the scale at which we can move people? So yeah, that whole piece about how the opposition can change. And I think in the power analysis, how do we wrestle with making assessments about whether the moves that we make were strategic? And so there's a debate actually within our crew in Durham about whether going after the county manager was actually the right move. Because it was after we got rid of him, and actually a lot of the things that came up in that fight that really consolidated our opposition. And we had to make this choice of like, all right, here's this person who was blocking wage increases for a key part of our base. Do we go after him? Or does that consolidate our opposition too much such that what we will lose is too significant? And I think that it's really key for us to move past kind of purity tests around how we make those decisions, because there's not some right answer that the righteous people will see clearly. it really is difficult decisions and a willingness to say there one way or another, something will be lost, something will be challenging, and what is it that will be gained, and are we willing to deal with what some of the costs are?
Yeah, I think this is to your point about Sendolo, like how we train people to do this is a panel in of itself. I think I actually want to spend a little bit of time there before we close, because I think that's been a through line throughout this conversation. And about, I think Brendan, maybe of all the panelists, like you speak to this most clearly because of the IE work y'all have had to do and the kinds of candidates y'all have had to mobilize a lot of resources and people to support. And because essentially what we're saying here is, how do we get our folks to be able to grapple with hard tactical decisions with us that is grounded in a sense of what the long-term strategy is, right? And to be able to your point, Alexa, make those assessments about our power and self-interest in the moment in relationship to where we're trying to go. And I'm curious if folks could just say, what does that process look like for you personally, right? What are the kinds of perspectives, competencies, ways of thinking that you feel like you had to develop to be able to get more skillful at doing that, to be able to say, yes, to go back to kind of my opening remarks, I never compromise my revolutionary imagination. And I don't just get to wave a wand and make the political choices I want appear in the world. We have to operate on the world as it is. And so, I think the question of how do we build organizations that train grassroots leaders to think that way, like that's a whole project that I personally think we need to spend a lot more time thinking about. But I am curious for just the people who are watching this, who are thinking about like, how do I get better at that? What are some of the skills I need to develop because I want to be able to be that kind of strategic thinker?
Yeah, I can say something to that if it's all right. I have so this is my favorite topic. I mean, I've been part of the same organization since 1996. I went on strike with Unite Here as a teacher at Yale, many years ago, and I've been with Unite Here for the entire time after that. And the reason is because there's a model of organizing that Unite Here, particularly Unite Here Local 11 here in the Southwest and in Southern California has, where we make all of our decisions together, everything. There's a committee for every single decision, in terms of like, we're going to take this action. And then when the action fails, are we going to go in this direction, that direction? If I want to quit, then I have to, get jumped out. You know what I mean? Like I have to talk to everybody about why I want to quit and give them a chance to convince me not to before I do. Right. And so when I'm feeling down, like I went through some very, very serious mental health challenges and people carried me through those times. And I felt like, so to get good at it, you have to, I think Sendolo said something earlier about vulnerability. And I think you have to be vulnerable and humble and willing to let other people teach you and carry you when you need to be. And, I always have this thought that, the good thing about that is when you're part of a team is when you win, everybody wins. When you lose, you're not on the hook yourself. So you can deal with losses, significantly easy. I do want to say one last thing, though, is that in political circles, Democratic Party and other circles, it's harder to do that because you're always looking for your next job. And you have your currency is basically your reputation and your profession of your skills. And so in a certain point, it's competitive. It's not supportive in the same way. So I think there are other spaces outside of a labor union in particular the kind of labor union we have, where it's much more difficult to do that.
Other folks want to chime in before we have to move to our close on this question?
I mean, I'll just speak on decision making. And I think, all of the easy, morally clear decisions are already made. And you don't need to build organization and you don't need leadership to make those decisions. You build organization and you need leadership in order to make decisions that aren't apparent, that aren't morally clear. And for those decisions, it's not a question about moralism or right or wrong. It's really a question of trade-offs and mitigating downside, maximizing upside, and determining when that downside falls, who does it fall on? And when that upside is realized, who realizes that upside? That's basically what we're ultimately deciding. And then when it comes to the moralizing, like, history ultimately will absolve us.
I love that. And just to build off of it, with our leaders, what we spend a lot of time talking about is, do you want to feel good, or do you want to get it done and be effective? And to make decisions, you need the full information about how power is operating. And like you said, what are the trade-offs? So it is a constant education around what is your power analysis. To come back to that again, what is your power analysis? Over and over and over again. And then that drives our decision-making process. And our leaders rise to that occasion every time.
There's a really important point there, Alexa, and then I see Sendolo, I want to see if you want to get on this question too, of like not underestimating the political sophistication of our people, right? That if we have to believe that our people can be the protagonists of the transformation that we want, and that means we have to engage in this in these conversations in honest and clear-eyed ways, the best that we can.
I really resonate with the things that the comrades have said already. So I think the only thing I would add to this is at a personal level or a spiritual dimension of things, I think there's a way that despair or desperation can overwhelm the kind of power analysis that Alexa was talking about, right? That it can show up pretending to be urgency or pretending to be like deep care as the disguise, but that kind of wanting to skip steps, trying to figure out a situation where there isn't a trade-off. I think that dynamic actually can slip in and break down our ability to have conversations. And so I think building tolerance for facing truth is just useful. And I think all of our people, like you were saying, Hashim, have practice in that, right? Like all of our people are wrestling with those things. And the more we can practice that together, I think it's useful for making strategy decisions. But I have also seen many of our members come back to our organization because developing that capacity to honestly face our lives, courageously face our lives, and then be able to take actions that actually make sense and get it done, like Alexa said, that is incredibly ennobling, enabling, liberating for our people. And they come back being like, I want more of that. And so I want to be a part of power building. And one of our staff members said in our staff meeting for this month that organizing has actually been a powerful part of transforming their whole life, not just the political domain. So I think that dimension flows throughout.
And that's a perfect and powerful note to end on. Thank you, Sendolo. This was fire, y'all. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Thank you to Forge and Convergence for bringing us together to ask and explore some of these really difficult questions. Thank you to all of the panelists, Sendolo, Alexa, Maurice, Brendan, for all that you do, for the rigor, the intentionality that you bring to navigating this tension instead of running away from it. And thank you for sharing your rich insight with us today. Thanks to the audience for showing up and engaging. Do follow and subscribe if you don't already. And we'll see y'all out there in the fight. Thanks, y'all.